This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for tuning in this week's NC Spin. Can you believe it? The groundhog is going to be looking for his shadow Sunday, and the Iowa caucuses are Monday. North Carolina's primary elections are a month away, but we aren't hearing much about them, and we want to know why. UNC President Bill Roper has pleaded with state leaders not to make the university system collateral damage in their political budget fights. Is he right? And we examine reflections from 3 former governors. Of course, it wouldn't be NC Spin if we didn't ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. This week's panel includes the newly retired Peg O'Connell, a political analyst, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Chris Fitzsimon, director of the Newsroom, and Becki Gray, the vice president of the John Locke Foundation. We'll begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
Before we begin, we want to speak a word of sadness. We learned this past week of the death of Oscar Harris, a longtime friend of many of us, a longtime mayor of Dunn, member of the legislature, who was on the DOT board, an outstanding citizen in our state, and we issue sympathies and condolences to his family and to his friends. Well, let's get started. Voters in Iowa caucus Monday night, and 1 month later, North Carolina's primary elections will be here. We're going to devote most all of next week's show to our Super Tuesday vote, but before we do, let's get sort of an early overview read. Becki, there's been so much national news demanding our attention. Are North Carolina voters even aware of the fact that, or paying attention to the fact we're having primary elections in a month?
Well, I think so. Of course, the impeachment hearings, the theatrics in Washington have sort of taken up everybody's space. We're starting to see a lot of ads on TV. I think that there's particular interest in the Democratic primary for president. Some of the down races, though, Council of State, we've got a lot of candidates in many crowded primaries in those, and then a lot of our legislative races as well have primaries. So, I think there's a lot of town halls going on. I think we're seeing things out.
I haven't heard that much about them.
I think in some of the districts there are those things going on. I mean, I'm hearing from candidates, from primary candidates, they're participating in some of those. But things will heat up in the next couple of weeks, I'm sure.
Peg, the only two, Becki was talking about ads, the only 2 ads that I've seen very much of were Mike Bloomberg's and Cal Cunningham's ads. Is it because the candidates just don't have any money?
Well, I think there are primaries, but in the down ballot races, the Council of State races, there are just so many people running. And television time is very expensive. You're hearing more radio ads, and you're seeing a lot of social media type ads, which people of our generation just aren't even used to looking at or looking for. So what we're used to traditionally hearing, we're not hearing right now.
Is there one particular race, John, that you're going to be looking at as sort of the indicator of interest and turnout and support?
Well, I don't know if it's an indicator of turnout, but I think on both the Republican and Democratic side, the primary for lieutenant governor is perhaps the one that is the hardest to sort out because there are so many candidates. There isn't one candidate who's well-funded and a bunch of other people who are hoping for a miracle. There's several candidates in both party primaries for that race that are well-funded, experienced politicians elected to other offices. I have no idea who's going to win those primaries. I don't think anybody else does. And that creates, as we've seen through the impeachment drama in Washington, one of the reasons why the public's attention has not been riveted on that event, whether they should have or not, is because they feel like they've already seen the end of the movie and they don't want to watch it. But that is not the case on some of these North Carolina races.
It's really interesting because I am going to go to Catawba County in Kannapolis a week from Sunday, February 9th. They're having all the Democratic candidates for lieutenant governor. The Democratic Party there is sponsoring it. And they're just having a hard time getting publicity. They're having, getting some interest in the whole thing. And I'm very eager to hear the 6 candidates that are running. Somehow or another in this process, Chris, because of the expense and because of all the noise that's going on the national level, we're not really able to meet these candidates and get to know them and know what they're running on.
I do think, though, I mean, one way the campaign is going on, there's fundraisers every night in Raleigh and in Charlotte and other places.
But they're usually for one candidate.
Right, and I know, but I'm saying a lot of the candidates are busy trying to raise their money to have a last-minute push and pay their staffs. I do think this is one of the negative parts of moving up our primary to March 3rd. It feels like just the other day we were celebrating Christmas and New Year's and the holidays, and now
just took the decorations down.
Right. I mean, traditionally we've had until May for all these candidates to spend a lot of time after they file to raise money to get their message out, to do mailings and all those sorts of things. It's all been compacted now, and it's coming.
I would go further than that, Chris. I think it is unalloyed bad thing. I mean, I understand the notion of trying to make North Carolina relevant to the presidential race. Frankly, that just invites those presidential candidates to come to North Carolina, which I think is a negative. But who wants them? But the other thing is, having that time all the way to May gave people a chance to introduce themselves to the voters because you file in December, or you have an election in May. This is too short a primary.
And not only that, but I don't think that we've seen some instances where some of these candidates have come in, the presidential candidates have come into North Carolina. They really hadn't put much focus here.
Well, and the people that actually run for our legislature and run for our Council of State are the people that impact the lives of North Carolinians every year. I mean, the president.
Those are the people who moved it.
Well, I know, which I think was a huge mistake. I agree with John. I agree with Chris. That. We are going to be overshadowed until we change it again.
And the people that have the advantage of this are people who have held offices before, that there's some sort of name recognition. It's not necessarily those candidates who may bring a lot to the table, but have a hard time introducing themselves.
And also people from urban areas, Republicans and Democrats, who have a larger population base that people know.
Well, one of the leading political consultants I talked with this week, along the lines of it's been a fairly quiet primary session so far, he said, look, the biggest problem with these candidates is the lack of fundraising. He said your $200 to $1,000 donor has disappeared. They are just getting so overshadowed by these expensive independent expenditure groups that they're taking their money and going to Myrtle Beach instead of contributing it to a
probably a better use of money, to be
honest.
Right.
But the other part of that story is there are a lot of interesting primaries. I think the lieutenant governor's race on both sides, others, but those giant independent expenditures, for the most part, would rather spend their money with one party or another winning in November in the general election.
I don't know whether any of y'all saw it or not, but the McClatchy organization that owns several newspapers in North Carolina went to every single county in the state interviewing people to try to find out what's on their mind. Now, what I got from the article that they reported on this is it doesn't seem to be any compelling issue. Is there, John?
Well, if the economy was doing much worse, and it's not spectacular, but it's doing pretty well, if it was doing much worse, that would have galvanized the public's attention. You would think the impeachment drama and the ongoing drama involving President Trump would have done so, but actually it's kind of now, I think, and personally been fading a little bit in the background because people have already felt like they've heard it all before, they've seen it all before, there's nothing new. There are some specific issues that specific clumps of voters, specific groups of interest groups care about a lot. But for North Carolinians as a whole, people who are even marginally politically active, politically engaged, I don't sense a tremendous amount of enthusiasm other than maybe rooting for or against the president.
I think they are tuned out and turned off. Did you see the Real Clear Politics poll that came out this week that said something like 75% of the voters say if it was up to them, they'd throw out every member of Congress? They're just they're
Well,
weary of this
I
whole
think
mess.
they are weary, but I think that's, that plays into sometimes incumbents' advantages. It depends on how the money goes. I do think whether we like it or not, President Trump is still the defining figure in North Carolina's election. The candidates for state office are going to try and make it otherwise, but that is literally the elephant in the room.
Tom, I found something interesting. Last week, the John Locke Foundation had a policy briefing for candidates. Now, mostly legislative candidates. We had Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians in the room. And during the Q&A, I was really surprised in the interest in the Leandro case. Just something that I didn't expect hearing from a lot of new-time candidates. And the discussion really led to the governance of education. I think that education is a key issue in North Carolina. From some parts, we hear about the teacher pay.
Issue, you think?
I think it is, and I think that it goes way beyond the 20% pay increase that teachers have gotten over the last 5 years. It really goes to what do we expect of education? Are we delivering those? How can we do it better? I think that's what that said to me as an issue that is really on people's minds. And I was just surprised at the level of interest.
And if the candidates are saying it to you, it is likely it's because they're hearing it from... They
want to know about it, yeah.
They're hearing it from the constituents,
right, but that surprised me a little bit.
One final thing on this subject while we're at it. Did y'all see the story that came out by this watchdog group, Judicial Watch, that said that there were more registered voters in Mecklenburg and Guilford counties, that's Charlotte and Greensboro, more registered voters than there were voting age people? What's your reaction to that story, John?
There have long been problems with voter rolls and the fact that they get outdated, they get outmoded, they need to be cleaned up. That is all true. That is all an argument for administering those systems better. It is not a suggestion that you have lots and lots of people voting who are illegally casting ballots.
So
That's
it does
not
necessarily indicate voter fraud.
It does not necessarily do so. There is such a thing as voter fraud. It isn't anything like the numbers that would suggest.
I'm going to do what political operatives call pivot right now. The January meeting of the UNC Board of Governors was understandably solemn. Board leadership expressed their concerns over not having a budget in place for this year and passed a resolution asking our governor and legislators to quit stalling and pass a budget. UNC President Bill Roper went further on to say that there's $630 million in capital projects, another $130 million in repairs and renovations in that budget that didn't pass. President Roper, Peg, said he pleaded, by the way, with the state leadership not to make the university collateral damage in this political standoff. Was he accurate? Is this an accurate statement?
Well, I don't think the university is about to close anytime soon, but I think Dr. Roper makes a very good point. There were expectations created not just at the university level, but throughout state government. I mean, so if the university's collateral damage, look what's going on with Medicaid transformation. The Department of Health and Human Services is being held hostage between this thing to move to Granville County, whether they had to let go all the contractors that were creating the transformation. There was money in there for broadband expansion into our rural communities. That's not coming out yet. So I think the whole state is we're all collateral damage in this standoff, and trying to plan for the future for any of the universities or any of our state-funded entities, it's all in suspended animation.
Becki, do people believe we don't have a budget in place? Now, you wrote a column this week that I thought was fairly interesting, in which you were trying to reassure people,
We have a budget.
Yeah, that we have a budget. Don't get distraught.
Right. According to North Carolina state law, if there is not a new budget passed, we just revert to the previous year's spending. So we have a budget, and a lot of the talk about this and collateral damage, and there's a lot of things that are coming up that, hey, the new budget didn't pass, particular things aren't being funded. We do have a budget, but, to add to Peg's point too, there's also a $200 million addition to the Brody School of Medicine that a lot of people are really concerned about. I mean, it goes on and on. So we have a budget. It's not the budget that anybody wanted necessarily, but we do have a budget.
And there is one thing, if I can just add a technical amendment to that. So anybody who had non-recurring funds, which is a lot of the way this General Assembly has funded things over the last decade, that money is all gone.
Yeah.
So we have less than last year's budget, but we do have a functioning system.
Talking about that, John, the UNC thing, back to that for a second. East Elizabeth City State University was going to get a new library. East Carolina was getting a new building for the Brody School of Medicine. The NC State was getting planning for a science building. There's a second school of math that's being built. over in Morganton.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All of these are projects.
Yes.
Which are right now in limbo.
And it would be a reasonable time to expend some dollars for these projects. We do have a significant revenue surplus. We also have unspent money from last year, so the unreserved credit balance for the general fund is, I think, north of $2 billion at the moment. Now, some of that will go away if and when you get a new budget passed, because some of these construction projects will be done, and that would be a reasonable thing to do, particularly for money that you may not see every year, but is in the coffers at the moment. It's one-time money. That would be an appropriate thing to do.
And interest rates
I think the
low.
entire mess, which does have collateral damage all over the place, I think it all illustrates the critical need for the governor and the legislative leaders to simply agree on what they agree on and leave the other stuff out and let the voters sort it out. Now, frankly, most of that's going to have to come from the governor, who's going to have to give up on Medicaid expansion. Just give up on it. Just say, well, we'll take it to the voters and maybe they'll give us a different answer. And he's going to have to agree to something much less than what he wants on some of these other things.
Okay, we
just
know
to make
the political.
a deal.
We know the
Make a
political.
deal.
Let me ask a question. You can say what you want to say. The political process is, I'll give you what you want if you'll give me what I want.
Right.
So what is the quid pro quo that the governor could get if he gave up on Medicaid expansion?
Well, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I'm not in the negotiations. I know that a majority of House committee of Democrats and Republicans voted for Medicaid expansion. It was put on twice. It was put on the House floor. The Speaker said he would have a House vote on it, and he never did it. That would have been a good first step, I think. The second thing is, if it's capital things we're talking about, the legislature used to pass a capital budget. If we're so worried about all these buildings, the General Assembly has the authority tomorrow to pass a capital budget with all these one-time expenditures in it and send it to the governor.
My former boss used to just rail at the legislators about, Harlan Bowles used to rail that we needed three budgets. We needed the continuation budget, we needed expansion budget, and we needed a capital budget.
Well, we had. That's the way we used to do it.
Well, okay.
And now we do mini budget, mini budget, mini budget.
But I'd
Easy
take some
for
more
you to
mini
say.
budgets at this point. There isn't anything else that has happened. At least if we did a few more segments of the budget, like capital projects or something else, then we would reduce the extent to which the dispute is affecting everybody else and everything
I
else.
think you can make an argument that it was a mistake what would have happened if we had not passed the law a couple years ago that the current budget stays in place? Would they have reached a budget if the budget was going to end and that was it?
They would have had to.
There would have been shutdown drama, and it would have been just like Washington, and it would have
It's
been
just like
very
Washington
unpopular.
now, I think.
But there's an easy solution to this. The General Assembly comes back on April 28th. They vote to override the governor's veto, and all of this stuff goes away.
Okay, so
that-
that's probably not going to happen.
Well,
Although,
but that's-
There's
I
another
mean, but
easy
that- but
solution. The
that's
House
the-
have a vote on Medicaid expansion. The Senate
Neither
say
of
that they'll
those
take it
things
up.
is going to happen.
That's right.
That's my point. Stop saying, if only they would give in.
well,
just
okay.
take
So
all that off the table.
Let's chase this rabbit a minute. The legislature comes back April 28th. It's going to take them a couple of days to find out where the water coolers and everything are again. Realistically, if they came back, if they could resolve this big difference over Medicaid, how long would it take before we had a state budget in place?
Oh, I think it becomes effective immediately.
No. How long would it take them to pass it?
I think at this point it is probably more likely the governor will propose a supplement to the budget that was never enacted.
Right.
And
You don't
the
think they'll
legislature
start
That's
over?
their job anyway in the short
No,
session.
this is kind of a start. In other words, they won't keep resolving last year's dispute. The governor will make a new pitch. The legislature won't accept it because it will have even more things that are out of the question for them. But what it will do is create an opportunity to say, all right, we're not going to agree on X, Y, Z. Just take it off the table, make a deal.
We've all
But I
been
think
hanging
it'll
around this
happen.
legislature for a long time. The primary purpose of the short session, which, by the way, was started in 1972. Up until that point, we'd pass a budget. It stayed in place for 2 years. We'd come back and we'd put another one in place. But in 72, they decided they needed to start tweaking the budget in the even years, what they called a short session. Now, Peg, you know full good and well these legislators are going to come back in here, some of whom, by the way, will not be there come January 2021. Mm-hmm. They're going to want to come back in and they're going to want to tweak this budget. So my question really is, how long, effectively, do you think it's going to take before we actually see a state budget?
So the rumors we're hearing is that the legislature will be here no more than 6 weeks for the short session. So if they are serious...
If I had $1 for every time...
So 6 weeks.
Becki, you hang out there a lot. You think there's any kind of attitude
Well, first
toward
of all, don't forget we do have a budget.
I
so
heard
don't forget that.
I read a column about it.
Okay, so like a new budget. What I'm hearing is that there may be some appetite in the House to try a few more of these mini budgets. Maybe addressing some of the university things that we've talked about earlier in this segment. The Senate, I'm hearing, is not really that interested in it. They feel like they've done everything they can. The governor's vetoed what he's going to veto. He vetoed the Medicaid transformation bill and funding for that as well.
You said they could override the veto. The other thing the Senate could do is just have enough. The other thing the Senate could do is just have a vote on whether or not to override the veto, and we could move on and have that not hanging over everybody for a year and a half.
Well, I mean that's certainly an option, and that may be one of it. And then incumbents run on their records,
That's right.
Every single one of those incumbents that's running for re-election, we know where they stand on the budget.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens, and I'm waiting to see whether or not this becomes anything of an issue during the March primaries. Not sure that I think it will. Let me switch again. 3 former governors who led our state for a total of 28 years gathered in Memorial Hall on the UNC campus recently, and again in Charlotte this past week, to talk about their years in office and share their wisdoms about today's issues. Don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to get some reactions as to some of the comments that former governors Jim Hunt, Jim Martin, and Pat McCrory made. Chris, you attended this presentation, saw you there. Let's begin with their assessment of our current political situation. All agreed that it was an unhealthy climate. Governor Martin said one reason for this, he thought, was because moderates have pulled out of both political parties, leaving each party to be run by those on the ends, the extremists. He recommended that moderates rejoin their parties, get involved, and force them back to the middle. What do you think about that response?
I'm not sure the moderates have abandoned it. I think they've sort of been out-shouted or out-talked, or social media. The percentage of people in the country that have Twitter is actually not as big as most people think, but that's where a lot of the debates are these days. I think people have a weird impression of that. I will say, and this might sound predictable, that one of the differences we literally have a president who, before he was elected, claimed that Barack Obama wasn't eligible to be president because he wasn't born in America. That used to be an outlandish thing, and only the extremists would say that. Well, now he's in the biggest office in the land, and he has allowed, the way he behaves, I think, has contributed a lot to our political discourse.
Well, John, Martin also suggested that we should form a moderate party and offered to lead. I thought I heard him offer to lead that. What do you think of that idea?
I think that Governor Martin is an interesting, compelling man. I tell you,
have just heard.
I wish there was a good biography of Governor Martin available on Amazon. But I would say I don't think there's much room for anything other than the 2 current parties. I think that's just the way the system has been set up, and I just don't think a new party would have sufficient support to
As
matter.
evidenced by the fact that the legislature recently passed a bill saying if you were an unaffiliated voter and wanted to run as unaffiliated or other party name that you came up with, you had to get 2% to sign a petition. 2% of the people registered in that district to sign a petition. That's an onerous.
But doesn't that show you they're a little scared that
Both
somebody
parties
might
have
start
always been
something?
scared.
But hold on a second. They made it easier for parties to get on the ballot. New parties to get on the ballot. That's how the Green Party now has easier access.
And the Constitution Party too.
So that's not really the direction of the legislature.
But it's still an onerous. It's
agree.
an onerous task. I don't think there's any question.
And it leaves a lot of people out. There was a Carolina Journal report this week on a judicial candidate that fell into that and kind of tells her story.
It was an interesting discussion, and I do want to come back to it because I think these 3 guys made some really good points, having the perspective of having led our state and also being good thinkers and looking forward to issues and topics that we need to talk about. And I will promise to do that on another show when we don't have as much time. Right now, it's time to switch over and ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Chris?
Interesting scoop in the last few weeks from all places, the Daily Tar Heel, about the sons of Confederate veterans who received $2.5 million. Before that, they received $74,999. A great story this past week. The story before that pointed out that they're a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. They are prohibited from engaging in political activity, but they've actually had a political action committee. They've been participating in elections. It seems fairly clear they have violated the law. A complaint has now been filed with the State Board of Elections. That is the group that we gave $2.5 million to.
And there was another interesting development in that this week, and some noted North Carolinians
Absolutely.
got asked to be on the amicus brief in that lawsuit. Becki, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, there's a new debt affordability study for North Carolina released this week that indicates we could borrow $11 billion over the next 10 years. The governor immediately announced he was going to spend it. State Treasurer Del Falwell has said, wait a minute, just because you get your credit card allowance expanded doesn't mean we need to spend it.
Peg, tell us something we don't know.
This weekend is the 45th annual Farmville Musicale, the longest running funder of scholarships to East Carolina School of Music.
Does the Farmville Chamber of Commerce pay
I
you?
was afraid people were missing Farmville news.
John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
The Trump administration has announced a new block grant for Medicaid option. Watch for that to affect not just debates about Medicaid policy, but the possible expansion of Medicaid in some of the states that haven't done it yet.
Yes, exactly. That could affect this state if we are considering Medicaid expansion or even our Medicaid reforms to some extent. It could impact that. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter. And by the way, many of you are doing it. Thank you. Give your feedback, read our weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. While there, subscribe to our podcast and also our YouTube channel. Next week, we're going to devote the show to the candidates and the issues in the upcoming March primaries. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.